Good morning. Today is the 5th of the second month of Adar and the 15th of March. And we're going to look at this actually at the very, very end of Parshat Pekudei. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 40, verse 34. 34 and again in 35. So let's look at what it says there. It says the cloud covered the tent of meeting. So after Moses constructed it, and we're now coming upon the first of Nisan, the day on which the tabernacle was inaugurated. We said there were 7 days before that Moses was constructing the tabernacle every day and then taking it apart again. And those were the 7 days of inauguration for the priests, for Aaron and his sons. So on the last day, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting since the cloud had rested on it, and God's glory filled the tabernacle. So this whole thing of the cloud, we're not going to get into it because it's a big topic in and of itself. Is there actually a cloud? Is this something that you see in prophecy? The long and short of it in the end is that there is such a cloud. There is something physical that you see, and the reason that they call it a cloud is because it's something that's very fleeting. It's not something that you would be able to hold on to or grasp, and that's sort of like what the cloud is meant to represent. But what I want to focus on is what it says here: the glory of God filled the tabernacle. It says this twice. Now, I want you to compare this with what it says when the temple was built. And we're talking about 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 11. And there it says, and the priests were not able to remain and perform the service because of the cloud, for the presence of the glory of God, it's hard to say it in English, but the house was filled with the glory of God. That's how we'd have to say it. Okay? So this is the reverse. I want you to notice the order. Here in Exodus 40, 34, and 35, it says, the glory of God filled the tabernacle. And in Kings, it says, Malachim, it says, the house, which is the temple, the equivalent of the tabernacle, was filled with the glory of God. What's the difference? That in our parsha, first it says the glory of God, and then it mentions that it filled the tabernacle. In Kings, it says the opposite. That first it mentions the temple was filled, and what was it filled with? The glory of God. Okay? I want you to look at the verses in Hebrew because in English it's very hard to translate to get it exactly right. Now, why the difference? Why is it sometimes that first the glory of God comes and then it fills the tabernacle? And then why is it that it fills and then you hear that it's the glory of God? What is the difference between saying this and that? And in today's class, basically what I want to do is I also want to address a comment that was put on the YouTube by someone who said, it's all very nice and good, but too many words to describe something that in the end you could describe much more easily, and he was referring to yesterday's class on the oil, the anointing oil. So first of all, I tend to agree because sometimes I get too wordy. And they could say things more concisely. But beyond that, I want you to understand that the words that we use, the analysis that we do, is not just because we're into the analysis. But this is exactly the difference between when the glory of God appears and when there's first a tabernacle. And let me explain what I mean. To explain this, we need to look at something that's well documented in the Talmud, that there are many chapters of Psalms that begin with the words, for David, a song, le David Mizmo. But there are also chapters of Psalms that begin the opposite. They say, Mizmor LeDavid, a song for David. And the Talmud asks, what's the difference between if you say, for David, a song, or you say, a song for David? And the answer is that it depends on what happened first. Was this an awakening from below, and then it starts with David, and David awakens from below, and slowly he achieves a level where he hears a new song? Or is it the opposite? That the new song came upon him first, it was an awakening from above, inspiration from above, and then it entered into him as David. So again, it's a question of who's awakening first. Is it David awakening first, and then achieving a level at which he can hear a new song? Or is it that God is awakening first, or the divine presence is awakening first, it's giving him by inspiration a song, and then it dwells within David, it comes to within David? That's the question. The same thing is true here. What came first? Was it first that there was the glory of God, and that would indicate, this is tricky, but it would indicate that the awakening is from below. The glory of God is from below, it's not from above. You would think that it's from above, but it's not. It's actually from below. I'll explain why in a moment. And that it fills the tabernacle or fills the temple is the awakening from above. Why is this so? Because whenever we say the glory of God, we're talking about something that is akin to kingdom, to the awakening from below. The glory of God is not something that comes from above, it's actually something that we declare, that we do. And so the order here makes a lot of sense, that the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of God, which was caused by all the work that they had done, and Moses now constructing everything, filled the tabernacle. And when it filled, it's the awakening from above, meaning the glory of God is all their actions, and comes down in response to that, the filling of the entire tabernacle. But when it came to building the temple, it was the opposite. How do we know that? Because they were already doing things in the temple, and there was no sense of holiness in it. They had constructed it, they had built it, they even started performing the services, but there was not yet a feeling, this cloud had not yet come down, there was no feeling that they had brought the divine presence down. And then it says, the divine presence came down, and then it filled the entire house. So it's actually, the divine presence here is coming from, meaning it first fills, and then we learn that it's the divine presence. So the filling is the coming down from above, and then we learn that it's the divine presence, it's the glory of God. What does this all mean? It means that we don't know how the meeting between the connection between man and God is going to appear at any given moment. We don't know. Sometimes it's our actions that lead to it, and sometimes it just happens to come down. It seems like there might not be any reason for it. What this means is that either way, whether it's us inviting it down or it coming down and then awakening us, there is work that has to be done in order to achieve a meeting. The meeting is not a given. It's the result. It's the result of some hard work. Now, it seems again that if God is inspiring me from above, there's less work involved. But the only reason that God is inspiring me above is it says He's filling some vessel that I've made from before. So even though when I made the vessel, nothing happened. It seemed to be empty. It seemed to not cause a reaction above. Sometime later, it could be a day later, could be a week later, could be a year, could be 50 years later. For whatever reason, now is the time for the meeting to happen, and I'm filled with, here as it's called, the glory of God. So to get back to how we study, we don't study this way just because it's an interesting analysis. Whenever we study the Torah, whenever we analyze its words, whenever we try to understand exactly what's being said, and we pay careful attention to every detail, we're building a vessel. We're building a vessel in our mind, a vessel of understanding. And since we are not prophets in this generation, the way that the meeting between us and God happens is through the development of those vessels in our minds. And again, it could be that sometimes we developed the vessel a long time ago and it didn't seem to have an impact. But then suddenly it's filled, our mind is filled suddenly with all this awareness of godliness. But it's still the result of the hard work that has to be put in. In the generations when there was prophecy, so I don't know exactly what type of work the prophets did, but it wasn't intellectual. It was a different type of work. But we know that we don't have prophecy today. And if there are exceptions, and there are always exceptions, it's not a path that every person can go down. What do we have in our generation? In our generation, we have a lot of intellectual effort. And this is true about any area of human endeavor that you look at. In David's generation, this was part of the work that they did as prophets, but like I said, I don't think this was all of it. They used music. And so sometimes David's playing on his instrument led him to bring the divine revelation down. But sometimes he could play for months probably, and nothing happened. And then suddenly something would appear. It was still the product of all the music that he had played. It was still the product of his becoming more and more expert in his craft. Because the craft then could be music. It wasn't the intellectual type of pursuit that we have today. But in our generation, the main type of pursuit that we have is the intellectual pursuit of Torah. And it's not an empty pursuit. It's not just saying, oh, this is very intellectual. This is saying, these are the vessels that in our generation we are meant and we are called upon to develop in order to allow the divine revelation to come down. And so, like I said, sometimes, like at the end of our Parsha, at the end of Exodus, the work, the tremendous work that went into this, and remember, they had finished constructing it 3 months earlier. But now, after 7 days of putting it together and taking it apart, and you could have said, why didn't it happen on the first day? But after all the work that they put in, which is called the glory of God, it's working for the glory of God, it filled the tabernacle. That work that they did became something that filled. And what do we mean by filled? Like it fills the vessels of the mind. It fills the consciousness. And that's why Moses, and then it says that Moses could not come into the tent of meeting because of this feeling that everything is full. Obviously, this wasn't like suddenly that the air inside the tent of meeting, inside the tabernacle, became solid. It wasn't because of that he couldn't come in. It was such a strong presence that he felt that he couldn't come in. So we have to remember this, that we don't do these things, we don't study this way just because we can. Just because we can analyze things until tomorrow. The real reason we do it is because this is the manner, these are the vessels that need to be developed in these generations. And it's the development of these vessels that brings down the divine revelation in our times. Thanks for joining. Chazak, chazak v'nitchazek. This is the last parsha of this Chumash, this book of Deuteronomy. And next week, God willing, we'll be starting Vayikra, Leviticus. Hope to see you then. Shabbat Shalom.